Thank you, Chaplain. Hey, so I tell you, I had a whole list of questions that I was given early on, and the response from all of you has been phenomenal. So keep the questions coming, and I'm going to pivot more to some of the questions that I've been getting from the floor and from online as well, because they really are great questions. So this is going out to the whole panel, or anyone wants to answer this. And it sort of ties in earlier. We talked about transition and transitioning out of service, but also we have a large component of soldiers and families that live in their community, either because they're Guard and Reserve, or they are in geographically isolated or remote locations. So if anyone wants to tell us sort of how is the Army leveraging community connections to ensure transitioning service members are all geographically dispersed, and their families, and ensure they have the support and services they need as they're within that civilian community. So anyone want to jump in on that?
I can start. One of the things that exists for folks that are in transition is a program that's exactly that. It's called In Transition. If you have not heard about the In Transition program, you can actually, very simple, just Google In Transition. It's one word. It helps individuals stay connected to resources. I will tell you from Behavioral Health Footprint, we utilize this. We'll actually enroll the individuals so that way they have these resources. They have coaches. They will connect them in whatever shape, fashion, form they need to be connected in. The In Transition is a very loose definition to allow anybody to use it. It's hugely beneficial. One of the things that, and another resource I'll just throw out there is Military OneSource. What people see in Military OneSource, In Transition does any time anybody is in any state of transition. They're PCSing, they're going from active to reserve, they're leaving the service, they're even transitioning, maybe they're transitioning their medical care. They're transitioning from being in the Guard and Reserve and they're going off duty, and how do I transition that care to my off-duty time? Those things are a huge piece, and that In Transition program is a huge issue. Are huge resource to folks. And as a matter of fact, I recently received a brief about In Transition. One of the things they're looking at doing is we leverage a lot of community-based behavioral health resources. And they are engaged in that transition of care outside of the MTFs, and that's a place that the Guard and Reserve can really, really leverage and that process. And they have transition coaches. They will help you figure out how to get your mortgage set up. I mean, it's not behavioral health. It's anything and everything in that transition process. And I will tell you anecdotally, I've gotten some feedback from service members, and it's been nothing but positive. And that's a really cool feature, and it's a huge resource for folks. Just you can Google In Transition, put it all in one word, and it's a huge benefit. I've seen huge benefits to service members leaving the service and transitioning their care to the VA. Whatever it happens to be, they're a huge, huge resource for that transition.
Yeah, I'd like to talk. I love there's a lot of Army-wide things. We've got a lot of veteran affairs things. There's a lot of programs that exist on federal level that are nationally available no matter where you are and what state you've been in the Guard or what area you've been in the Reserve. But this is something where I would definitely volunteer the CASA program to help. Each community also has wonderful resources that might not be federally funded. They might not be run specifically through the Army or specifically through the VA. Groups like Boys and Girls Club, a lot of nonprofits. And that's where it really might be community to community. And that's not to say it's not equitable from community to community or state to state, but some of those differences might be there to where maybe you've transitioned, you've PCS'd out for the last time, you're going to where you used to live 20 years ago, but it doesn't look like that anymore, or you've decided to retire somewhere else completely different. Finding those community connections, finding out how that state, what their policies might be. There's different state rules and regulations and things that might vary from community to community. So I think the most important thing there is just maybe being a little bit proactive to find out where are those resources. because like I said at the very beginning, I've been astounded at how many resources there are, not only through tax dollars, but on the private side too. The Army has the PAYS program where we try to work with different professions and companies that are very veteran friendly, military spouse friendly. They want to really integrate all the talent and experience that our Army brings back to the civilian world. And so CASA could really help with that and maybe know, hey, in Utah, this is how we do it, or in Wyoming, this is what happens, or in the Bay Area in California, we've got this great program you might not be familiar with because you're not from that community, but please reach out and let us help with some of those transitioning processes, especially if you're the one helping to facilitate that. Obviously, we can help each individual family, but if you're working in one of the offices or if you're in the leadership that's maybe helping get people ready to transition out, make sure they know to not just say, oh, I can't find it, I guess I give up. The resources are there. Let's make those connections. Let's utilize social media. As much as it can isolate us, it can also connect us. Let's find those community groups that are on the very grassroots level, and let's get everyone that piece of connection they have. It was mentioned yesterday in one of the other panels how when you're in the Army, you have an identity, you have a purpose, you know where you belong because you're assigned there. And then you get into the civilian world and you transition and you're moving on to be a soldier for life, and no one's telling you exactly what to do and what to wear and where to work today. And so there's kind of a lot of overwhelmingness that comes to that transition. Please don't do it alone. This is a great opportunity to bridge the military with the civilian world, and CASAs are just one of the many resources that can help facilitate that transition.
And Steve, in that same vein, I think as people start to transition and they start to plan for that, they stop in their ACS center and see those. Because you have financial readiness counselors there. How do you prepare to retire? What the resources they have available for you as you prep for that? Or the employment readiness program, we've added a number of new employment readiness counselors out there. We're going up to 31 new ones now in the Army. And what are those resources they have available as you transition out and prep you for that, what that next career is or what that next life cycle is for you? And as many of our folks know, we have a lot of home-based businesses on post. As you look to transition that off post, maybe if you move to a new community, again, that ACS is that resource, and there's so many of those resources available, as Jenny said, that they can plug you into as you start to do that. So really it's, for me, as you look at that ACS, it's just a resource center. They may not help you right there in that center, but they can get you to someone who does. So really that integrated we should look at.
Yeah, super. And so this one is another one to the group. Just sort of put your collective minds together on this one, and it speaks to understanding and knowledge of resources. And so the question is, the Army is more than a job; it's a community. And no one knows this better than some of our, and I'll use the quotes, seasoned spouses, I think that was used yesterday by Eddie Menser, who have supported each other through the last 20 years of war. They've been receiving advice and guidance to find a new way to connect with this new generation of spouses. And they find that the unit gatherings and coffee groups are falling by the wayside and less interest for those. So how do we connect with these with the younger soldiers and their families, and balance the need and really make sure they understand what's available in the community and what and overcoming that presumptive lack of interest, if you will. So think through that. Chaplain.
Everybody has an innate sense of wanting to belong to something. It's probably why, whatever the selfish reasons, and I will say that at a entry level, coming into the, I came in so I could get educational benefits, or I came in for this. But underneath it all, when you really dig in the narrative, they wanted to belong to something bigger than themselves, to make a difference and to make an impact, and to be a part of this Army community and family. So I think that, we're, I think, in that seasoned category, Joe, right? Yeah, so we kind of struggle like some of the other seasoned people in the room with like things that we've known in our culture that really gave us a great framework. I mean, our first assignment as a chaplain family, right? 4 kids in a pickup truck, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, here we come. And that sense of belonging, connection, how we were brought into that community, the customs and culture, the things that, but we brought a desire to belong. That's all we brought. They gave us the package of reception, the connections, and that's really what we're talking about here. So we're going to have to take this younger, less seasoned generation and find out what it is. You mentioned it earlier. Where do we make the connections? How will they shape their culture? It's not maybe going to be the same culture, the same kind of connections that we experience, but they do want to belong, they do want to connect, and so we've got to be willing to be flexible and agile in how we see the younger generation. It's not autocratic, and embrace them and let their ideas find legs. And there's a lot of ways that I think we can do that. But we got to retain what is essential in the culture while allowing changes within the culture that are healthy, that brings in new generation of people.
I feel like we're continuing to learn how to do this. This is a muscle we've not had to flex. We know that the digital world is something that can connect us and divide us at the same time. And I think as more seasoned individuals on the panel, and I think from what I can see in the audience, we recognize the incredible benefit of being a connected community. I still miss the being a part of the Navy community because I knew exactly what other people were talking about. The language was shared. How do we bring that forward, bringing the digital world, being able to connect with younger service members and their families to create virtual spaces for conversations, and then bringing those in person? And I think each of us has a way to do that. While we may not be digital nomads, we know how to use our phone, text chains, virtual meeting spaces, taking the things we learned during the pandemic. For us at Boys and Girls Clubs of America, it was Virtual Club. We literally within a few months turned on every digital asset we had to reach young people. And I know everyone on this panel learned how to really use digital technology in a way that we never thought we'd be capable of. How do we take those wonderful things we learned during a really traumatic time and make them help us, help our younger service members feel connected the way we all did? Because we know that as a part of retention, building community is key to that, whether it be at a Boys and Girls Club for young people, whether it be through CASA and the other resources that are available. I think it's really upon us to think about how do we bring the human connection back to military service and being a military family and learning from what we've done and bringing it into today's digital space.
Super.
I'd love to add, I feel like I'm maybe reasonably seasoned. I've got what feels like a lot of years of exhausting life behind me, and I still have a 4-year-old at home. Wow. And so I would say to any of you that maybe are of a generation that maybe there was that coffee club and there maybe was Thursdays at the country club or what for this gathering of particularly spouses and families, please don't misinterpret my generation and younger's lack of participation in that as lack of need for connection. And please don't misinterpret that as an apathy because I don't know to show up at such and such time for tea, because it's just not my, like the chaplain said, we've got to be flexible. I would challenge you, if you're feeling like there's a lack of connection between you, that multi-generational connection between you and maybe someone younger, reach out. Because odds are those of us my age and younger don't know how to reach up. Sometimes that's intimidating. Sometimes when you're the mom with the spouse deployed and you've got all those young kids and you look at the general's wife or you look at the sergeant major's wife, you feel like they have everything under control and all together, and the house must always be clean. I'm the one that when my husband was deployed, my ecclesiastical leader's spouse stopped by my door to check on me while my 2-year-old was running around bare naked out of the bathtub with 1,000 toys. I know she meant to come and help. I was mortified. And so she knocked on the door and misinterpreted my reservation to her visit as, oh, Jenny just doesn't care, or she doesn't want to connect. That would have been a real loss for me and my family. Instead, that woman could see probably her younger self when her 2-year-old ran around naked at the door. And she would come, she would help with laundry, or she dropped by a meal during that deployment. I think there's ways we can help other people without worrying about it being the perfect way. If you think of something that might have been helpful to your 20-something-year-old self, offer it. It might not be received the same way your 20-year-old self would have received it 20 years ago, but the offering is still worth making. And it can be, like I said, a chore around the house during a deployment or something. It can be a simple text message. Technology does bridge the gap. I can live wherever I live and still check on you with a quick emoji. It can take me 2 seconds and a fat thumb to send something. I would just put in a plug, taking off my CASA hat completely. Please help our survivors continue to feel connected. There is nothing we crave more than to make sure you know all we wanted to do was stay married to a soldier for life. When my husband enlisted as a young kid, 3 days after we got engaged to be married, he was in it. We were in it. Our hearts stayed in it for 4 deployments in 15 years. And then he died. And the Army was wonderful at the funeral, and wonderful with the honor guard, and wonderful with the CAO. And then time goes by and does the thing that we all hate that it does, and yet it does. And that is, it marches on. Please, as you move forward, whether you've transitioned after retirement or only 2 or 4 years of service, or whether you're in longer than I've been alive. No, I admire that. I admire that. I'm just saying.
Now we have a real generational issue unfolding.
That was cold.
I thought this was going to get a little saucy here, but I didn't know it'd get
There we go.
My point was, you have served our country longer than I've even lived in this country, and I thank you for that. Please help those of us in the survivor community know we're still part of the Army family. Not just after the funeral, and not just if we randomly end up as a CASA. Because most Army survivors are not CASAs. And most Army survivors aren't in their mid-40s. A lot of our Army survivors are very young. And so are their children. And whether it was their father or their mother or maybe an adult sibling, someone very close to them loved this country and this cause enough to die for it. Please, the rest of us who are still alive, help them understand why they loved it enough to die for it. Please help my children not just look to the Army as the thing that cost them what mattered most to them, but something that they can understand mattered most to their father because of what it offers them. So CASA hat aside, please hang on to the survivors.
Yes, thank you, Jenny, and thank you again for the support that you've given not only to your family, but to the Army and the sacrifice you've made. We talked, actually, it was a good segue, though, too. We were talking a little bit about children. And, we talked a lot right now earlier about spouses and how to connect the spouses. But we have a whole army of children, too, that are part of our community as well. And they spend a lot of hours at school. This is a question from the audience. So and a lot of those schools are off base. We know 70% of our family members live off base. They attend the local schools, they go to the local churches, they go to Target, or, and the PX as well. But children spend a lot of hours at school. So when we think about that, what resources and recommendations do we have that are specifically designed for our military kids of all services to address loneliness in their schools or through their transitions throughout? So does anyone want to talk a little bit about that? Josh.
So I think first, as you look in the transition, the big piece for us is the school liaison officer. As you transition in to a garrison, that's your first point to see where you go to from there. And then we also have set up with these schools, we have youth that will do an ambassador program. As you show up, they'll assign a youth to these new youth coming in, and that becomes that touch point as they get to their community. And then they start to go out to see where they're, and it depends where they live. Most of them come on initially, but they may be on post, maybe off post. Obviously, if they're on post, if we go OCONUS, it's a lot easier because of the DOD programs. We have an MFLEC in there that does that as well. We have an ambassador program that all runs through that. But if you're on CONUS, we do that at most of our CYSs. We'll have that at your regular size garrisons, larger. Lots of resources available to how do we plug them in. Then you have your youth programs, you have your youth centers, you have boys and girls clubs, you have the 4-H, and those aren't just on post. We have those partnerships, you can do those off post. We have those resources that depending where you are, we know many places like Fort Carson will have 15 school districts around them. So how do you plug in each one of those school districts? And those are those things that your school liaison officer, your COS, will help you with on each garrison. So that's your first point of contact. You see them, they will help you find those resources that help you to plug your child in your community, whether it's just the one school district where you're at or maybe it's the 15. But they've been there, and that's their job, is to help plug you in, and they're there to be a support and advocate for you.
Go ahead.
The only thing I would add to that is that Boys and Girls Clubs are in over 2,800 schools across the country, which connect in-school time with out-of-school time, and we work really closely with the school liaison officers as well, because I think the number one thing we want is to have just a seamless integration of that young person into their new community, to be able to connect them to that feeling of belonging. So we're working each and every day to try and identify ways to make it simpler, more accessible, and I would urge you to go to either the digital site that Josh spoke about or bgca.org to find a Boys and Girls Club in your local community.
One of the things, too, that's in the school systems, and this comes out of a clinical footprint, is there are school psychologists, there are school counselors. Those resources are available everywhere. One of the benefits that I've been able to interact with is some of your team out of the Army or Armed Forces Community Services is the military family life consultants that are embedded in the school systems. Those school systems, we talk about the plethora of resources that we've got that this big Army machine provides for folks, is that MFLEC resource does a lot of preventive work, works on education. How do I, if I feel stuck in my room at home, how do I engage? How do I take that next step? They do a lot of preventive education modalities for these students. And the really cool thing about that is the schools that are closely affiliated with military installations, the entire school benefits from that. And that's a huge piece. Additionally, there's 12 or 13 Defense Health Agency programs that are at various installations that have school-based behavioral health. It's actually a military resource to military children within the school systems. My last duty assignment when I was in Louisiana, we were in the process of just building that. So those are actual clinical providers within the school systems. So there's a ton of resources, and I think one of the challenges, and you don't want to get deemed the bad rap of, you know, a parent of a special needs child because I'm going after every single resource there is. Well, that's not the most of the parent population. Most of it is they don't know what to do. And providing them that next step in what those resources are, there's a lot of it out there, both provided by the military on the civilian side of things, and that's absolutely huge because it's critically important. We talk about the connection, and it's got to be real, and it's got to be present in that moment, because that's a big piece of things to what we're doing. Is because if you're interacting with folks and those kids are interacting and it's very superficial in nature, that gets lost. It's one of the things in the military community that I've held near and dear to my heart, is that sense of community, and it's a real sense of community, and that's a big piece.
And your chaplains can help you when you're in the process of moving from location to location. The faith-based organizations that operate on the installation, as some have already been identified, and then the partnerships with the local community, because we may not have everything on the installation. And then if you're in the reserve and guard, that's a whole nother variable. So then those partnerships become really, really important. And the chaplains are there to bridge those connections. I think of our Army Volunteer Family of the Year, a very important principle of passing on spiritual legacy to your children, right, is acts of service. Getting your kids to do things for others. I mean, whatever it might be, there's 100 things that you could do in the local community. And so building relationships in the local community and say, how can we serve, I think is a real gift that you can give to your children as you're going from location to location to location, getting them involved in the community and taking some ownership in the place where they live.
If there's anyone here that lives more in that kind of guard or reserve world where there isn't a big installation that has a military life specialist, I think sometimes teachers and administrators would really benefit from you just kind of having a conversation with them. I remember the first time my husband deployed, our oldest child was in first grade. And I just realized this school has no clue what this is like. Would my kid's teacher even have known her father was gone to war and she's 6 years old if I didn't bring it to her attention? So I can stay home and get angry that she doesn't understand and the teacher has no compassion, or I could take the initiative and make the connection to say, hey, Mrs. Ricks, this is what's happening. Maybe let me know if you see behavior issues. I want you to be aware that something's happening in our military family dynamic, because 99% of the kids in our elementary aren't military families. So a little different component. The needs of the child are still the same, and I think the willingness of the teachers to help is just the same. The availability of the counselors and the school therapists is the same. They need that awareness, and sometimes I think we expect them to be mind readers, and they just can't be. We can offer that information and keep them in the loop, particularly when we're not in a military community.
And Steve, I think Colonel Crow brought up EFMP, and we've seen some big improvements there, I think, as far as connections as we move into garrisons. We've started to see now, we've had some training with the SJA to help as be an advocate for those parents to deal with some of the school systems. And they've now got in place the support for those. If the SJA doesn't have that specialty, they have a reach back capability to a civilian law firm that will also help those families they go to connect. Because we know as people move into new school systems, it's hard to kind of get that connection sometimes. And there are some challenges, and as they do that, how do they quickly integrate? And so those resources that are now coming online are really a big improvement we've seen in years past.
Yeah, that's a fantastic improvement, and I'll take a few moments just to put a little plug in. Downstairs here at the pavilion, the Family Readiness Pavilion, there are a lot of great military support organizations that are supporting them, everything from Military Child Education Coalition, as well as some of the other MSOs, VSOs up there, as well as Military One Source. A great resource as well to get that information about children. So those are my plugs for MOS and also for AUSA Family Readiness Pavilion. This one is going to be to Josh, and it's about the Army Soldier and Family Readiness programs. This comes from Schofield Barracks. Will Army Soldier and Family Readiness programs be standardized across the components and installations? When will all Army programs be available to all Army soldiers and families? Soldiers and families have continued to be turned away when seeking assistance due to their duty status, Compo 2 and 3.
So what I'd say, depending on the programs, if you're looking at FMWR, those programs are available. So we just to make sure if someone's saying no, then that needs to be worked through the chain. Those programs are available. If you have access to the installation, you have access to those programs. We look to see what's available now. We've talked now with National Guard is putting a NAFI in. They're starting to build out their programs as well, so that's going to expand what's available to the Guard, who may be a little bit different from a normal garrison. They may not have that same type of programs. That's going to grow. But as far as the Guard Reserve, we also have the Armed Forces YMCA program for fitness programs that are available, and then tons of resources just with communities that are out there. Then obviously the cost would be a resource sheet that we'd have to reach to in some of those garrisons that we don't have, maybe a garrison in close proximity. But those programs should and will be available. If that's not happening, then it just needs to be reached out either to the local DFMWR or the garrison commander.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to go into this one. This is for Colonel Goke. How are we bridging the gap for shortage of behavioral health care for children, spouses, and soldiers? I'll lead with that one, and then hear what you've got on that.
Definitely, there is a national shortage of behavioral health providers. There's an increased demand and simultaneously a shortage. As with the Army, we're struggling with recruiting, so we're working on pay issues, those sorts of things. But practically speaking, what are we doing? Chaplain Soldier brought up Alaska. There's some things we've done there to enhance support there. That's kind of some of the models that we're working on. One of the things, one singular component with two pieces to it is the advent of virtual health. We learned that lesson during COVID. It's beneficial. Actually, I don't need to geek out on numbers on you, but virtual behavioral health is as effective as face-to-face. We've been leveraging this a lot more. As the military health system transitions to Defense Health Agency, we have resources across services and that we can borrow and increase our overall bandwidth that we're working towards. Some of that can be co-located, some of that can be done through virtual health. So there are virtual health platforms within the direct care system, within the military treatment facilities on the installations. Secondarily, there is two, I'll say, fairly new contractors with TRICARE. One's been around for 3 or 4 years, I believe, and the other one has been within the last 18 months. It's called Telemind and Doctors on Demand. These are two resources available nationally, and I say that with an asterisk behind it because there is a caveat with off the installation. If you're outside of the state, you do have to transition your providers from state to state based on state licensure. But there are a lot of these resources that are out there. Historically, telehealth, prior to the pandemic, TRICARE did not authorize. They do now. And so that's a huge piece. One of the challenges is, even in the civilian network community, the TRICARE resources are limited. The fact that Telemind and Doctors on Demand is now available as a brand new resource to us. They are being highly utilized. When I was at my last duty assignment, I was the top user in the entire region of it. And I was at a small installation in little old Louisiana. And we use that resource to the max. But the more you use it, obviously you're using their bandwidth up, so it does become congested. So there are a lot of these resources out there that we're looking at. The other piece to it is, and it's what we were talking about here a minute ago, is providing, and I alluded to, and I kind of jokingly said it, that putting the individual in the right resource that's needed. There are a lot of challenges that go on. Behaviors get equated to behavioral health. They're not the same. And putting them where they belong. As I joked about, writing somebody a Prozac for a finance problem isn't going to help. Those things are being looked at to help leverage putting the individual where they belong. That's not turning them away from a behavioral health footprint at all. Those individuals still may need a lot of support because they may be really, really struggling with their finances. But their struggle with those finances is not going to change until we get them to a finance resource. And so that's the big piece of things that we're additionally trying to do. And the other side of it is that we're trying to engage the prevention resources. There's a lot of this. The Army's favorite term is to get to the left of the boom. The prevention work groups that are out there. How do we get ahead of these things to prevent long-term chronic clinical problems that I have to treat in a behavioral health footprint over the long haul? And that's incredibly important, is getting to the left of that. And a lot of this it goes back to what this session's called, is building connections, is that engagement and understanding and mitigating. I'm stressed out by my first line supervisor. How do I manage that? And that's a connection. How do I manage that connection? And getting after those sort of things, because when you deal with the day-to-day stuff, somebody had alluded to, you exercise that muscle in social interactions. We broke that social interaction. How do we rebuild that so that way that individual, and one of the things that the folks that work with me closely, they know that I do a daily check-in with them. I do that personal engagement, that authentic interaction. Hey, you look like you didn't sleep well last night. Those simple things to stay ahead of it before they get to us. So that it really excites me in these sort of forums, because in behavioral health care, I'm the back end. I'm the lagging measure, if you want to use data terms. There's a bunch of leading stuff that we've really got to get after, and there's not a single silver bullet to that. 1,000 resources, interactions are going to help that one negative output. And that's important, is those are the things that we've really, really got to leverage.
Yeah, I think you really hit on something that I heard yesterday too as well. It's about really stitching together all of the resources into this holistic sort of capability, whether it's military family life counselors or the chaplains or the SLOs and what's available at ACS. It really is about bringing together those resources. So thank you so much. Chaplain, this one's for you, and it sounds like it's a tough one here. But I know you will thrive on this one. You mentioned 30% is spiritual and 70% is environment. How does spiritual readiness protect us against harmful behaviors?
So, building that scaffolding, as I mentioned earlier, and if you look at the research data, It's the single most, spiritual health and well-being is the single most preventive, protective factor in our existence. And 80% protective, more protective against substance abuse, 70% more protective against risk-taking behaviors, 60% more protective against depression, issues of anxiety, loneliness, those types of things. And then suicide, 70%. When you couple that, spiritual life and development, so there's really 6 things that we look at when we talk about spiritual life. We look at having spiritual activity or spiritual daily engagement, spiritually, as we talked about. Talk about grit, forgiveness, life meaning and purpose, optimism, and then good old gratitude. Just being thankful and taking inventory of all the goodness in your life that exists every day, and the relationships that you have with others. Those things are absolutely critical foundation to it, and what we see is that starting on the left-hand side, your spiritual life then drives the outcome of everything else. And what you also see is these things cluster in people. So let me ask you a question. If you think of somebody high in optimism, high in grit, really seems to have a strong sense of meaning and purpose in life, who are you thinking of? If you were just to reflect for a moment, usually, at least with my mind, usually one person. I think of somebody immediately that comes to mind. Why is that? Because all of those things cluster in people that have a strong spiritual core. So, looking at the protective factors, Dr. Miller, when she does her presentation, she often says from her profession, if she found a pill that would give you 10 to 15% better outcome, the FDA would approve it today. All right, and everybody would take one. All of us. We'd be on this pill, this magic pill, right? Well, here you have these protective factors that I've just enumerated. We should be taking those pills. This is something very important to us as individuals, as a society, as a culture, as communities, that we understand how important spiritual life is, and that we embrace it. Dr. Miller also says, if I had that kind of pill for my kids, I'd sleep in the rain in front of Walgreens waiting for the doors to open. So there needs to be a sense of urgency about our spiritual life. And coming out of COVID, a pandemic, and the isolation, the social isolation, which the Surgeon General just recently stated that one of the major health threats is diseases of despair. It's a spiritual problem as much as it is a cognitive problem and other issues, but it has a spiritual foundation. So the spiritual life is very, very important to the outcomes that we're striving to achieve in connections and in healthy communities.
So we have about time for 2 more questions. So this one's going to be the panel, and we've talked a lot about different populations. It's our National Guard, Army Reserve. We've talked about our children. We've talked about spouses. So this one, though, is a good one to the panel as well. And I talked earlier about illness and injury potentially is one of those where we're vulnerable to loneliness. So how do we connect to families and wounded warriors?
I find personally, I'll take that approach. We all have connections, right? We know people. So it's not just a program, although we need that. We need structure. But it's the relationships that we have with people. How many of you, show of hands, know somebody who's lost somebody? Well, I do. And we'll talk later about the generational thing, all right? So I'm glad I could be a visual aid for you today, all right? But I still do PT every day. There you go. So I think that these things are very important, that we understand our role as individuals. That's my point. That we all have relationships and connections with people. We see them on social media platforms that you're on. Reaching out to them. I have anniversaries with people who've lost a soldier, right? And so on those anniversaries, I know how difficult those times are. And just as a person, I can reach out. Each of us, we have connections. We know people who've suffered egregiously in the loss of a loved one. And we need to take inventory of ourselves and make sure the relationships that we have, that we're doing the right things. And then obviously, as we look at sustaining this, it's easy, I believe, easier in the last 2 decades where our focus was, and now that focus is shifting. It's easy to forget. I felt your words. It's easy to forget as we look to a different future. We must never forget the sacrifices that have been made on our behalf that keep us free, and then those who are still paying that bill for us today. But a lot of this is personal connection. And maintaining those personal connections with people.
We often talk about the elephant in the room, and maybe you see someone who's been one of our wounded warriors, catastrophically injured. Maybe they've had to medically separate prematurely. They thought they'd make it a full 20 years and they didn't. And you might maybe know that soldier, or the spouse, or their children in something. And it is, even though human nature craves connection, human concern just kind of gets quiet, and we just pretend we don't know. And that's true whether someone's been wounded or injured or is at Walter Reed or is in a casket in the ground. And so you might run into me at the grocery store or the child of a wounded warrior, and you don't know how to approach it, and so you just pretend nobody sees the elephant in the room. And then we say, take a bite of the elephant, one bite at a time. Well, who wants to eat elephant? Nobody wants to eat elephant. The elephant's in the room, let it be in the room. There's nothing more refreshing than that honesty, that vulnerability to say, I'm sorry your service member was wounded. I'm sorry your dad died. Don't feel like you have to try to fix it, because that gets frustrating and impossible. Help each other face it. Again, that might be with a text message, some flowers, a meal. Physical things need help. If someone's been wounded, imagine you're the dad and you're wounded. What would your wife or kids need help with? It's not that hard for you to picture that. If you've been deployed, some of the things your family might have needed help with. That wounded warrior's family probably needs help with some of those things. That deceased soldier's family probably needs help with some of those things, and they're probably not going to ask, because we raise a real strong culture of resilience and independence, because by Americans, we just do everything by ourselves, and that's just hogwash. And I would just say that the same, whether it's wounded or medically separated or separated for emotional health, mental well-being, maybe they're not fit to serve anymore psychologically because of the trauma they've seen, or if they're deceased, remember to let them still be part of the Army family. Make sure they don't ever feel like they failed. That injury is no sign of incompetency. That injury is a sign of dedication and sacrifice. And I would say whether the wounds are visible or not, we as a nation can do better at expressing that gratitude. Less than 1% of you serve in the military. That means there's 99 of me for every one of you. To express that gratitude, not just if you die, not just if you're injured, but every day you put on that uniform. Because just by getting dressed this morning, you showed me in a very visible way you'd give your life for me. And so I would say, how do we connect to survivors? How do we connect to wounded warriors? How do we connect to everyday veterans who might be healthy and strong and doing great in the civilian world? I think it's that good old gratitude. I think it's not ignoring the elephant in the room, because it's a fairly large thing in the room. Acknowledge it. One of the best things one of my college roommates said to me after my husband died was, this sucks. Period. She didn't have to elaborate. She didn't have to say, but it's so great, I believe in God and he's in a better place. Though I do. And she didn't have to go on and say, but your kids, and this sucks. Some of our wounded warriors, it really sucks. They've given their body to our country, and sometimes they might feel like they're still stuck being alive. Or some of our wounded warriors might be mentally wounded, or maybe they're doing great and they have survivor guilt because the other guy's not. It all comes down to just being a little more vulnerable with each other and a little more open about the fact, I know you're catastrophically wounded. I know you're grieving a loss. Don't ignore the elephant in the room. Acknowledge it and be willing to help people face the very thing that none of us really can fix. And I think that's what that spirituality is. It gives us tools to face life's trauma and difficulties when we wish we could fix it. And most of life is out of our control in that way.
Jenny, I would add on to your incredibly eloquent and thoughtful words by saying that there are so many organizations that exist, whether it be TAPS, the Wounded Warrior Project, and many others that also can build community around those that have suffered these types of catastrophic injury and loss. And, you know, the nonprofit community has kind of built an ecosystem of support for all of us to access when it's needed. And the most important thing I think we can do as those that care about the military community or are a part of the community is helping those connections be made. So we can make sure that there is access to those supports, because they've been built to do that and they do it so incredibly well.
So I don't mean to cut you off, but we do have a little bit of time left here, and I have one final question for the panel, and I'll start with you, Jane. If you had one thing that you wanted everybody to leave with today, one thought or one action that you wanted everybody to leave with today, what would it be?
You know, I would say make sure that those that are in your circle, those that are in your community, know that getting young people involved in out-of-school time programs is essential, and that doesn't stop when kids are 12. I think many of us who have, you know, parented young people, you know, they start to bristle about going to a program when they're 13, 14, 15. The programs that are available, including Boys and Girls Club, and there are others, are really morphing their services to make sure that they're providing what young people need at different ages and stages. You know, when we think about teens, we know that if they stay connected to a youth program on installation that has Boys and Girls Clubs and 4-H, whether they find one out in the community or they stay involved in sports, have a greater likelihood of success. And what we know in Boys and Girls Club world is that we want to be able to provide experiences for young people that make sure they're life and work ready. And that could mean anything from being involved in a Keystone Club and being able to do community service and really give back to the point that we discussed earlier, or it's being involved in an apprenticeship program, you know, or is it college readiness? We're looking at young people and meeting them where they are so that we can help them matriculate with life and work readiness skills. So I would just ask you to identify those in your community that need access and help them navigate through the myriad of opportunities that are available, including Boys and Girls Club. And I've got these on every seat so you can access the information, and really look forward to continuing to build that support as we move into the future.
Steve, I think the thing that was pretty common in talking with the panel earlier was that there's an amazing amount of resources available, but just not known down to all the soldiers and families. So I think for me, the takeaway is if you don't know where to go, start asking that question. And I would say for us, the Digital Garrison app is a place to start with. But there are so many things the Army is doing for soldiers and families, and the resources are there. So how do we communicate that out? So if you don't know where it is, ask that question, look on those places, ask the people at ACS or anywhere else, and they will get you going in the right direction.
Additionally, since this panel is about connections, it's really important, and frankly, it's a recruiting tool. When I got to 20 years, my wife said to me, she goes, "You don't want to get out, do you?" And I turned and looked at her, and I said, "You don't want me out." It's this sense of community and connection that we have, and she has it as well. But it's how do I know how to connect those to resources? You know, in the Army, we teach the soldiers. What do we do to make sure they get it? We train them. We teach them the ACE model, ask, care, escort. What's the first letter there? Ask. You know, we were talking about somebody struggling. What's the most awkward thing to do is walk away awkwardly. Why not ask? Once you're past that first step, it goes so much easier. There's a lot of conversations that happen, you know, how do I ask somebody about being suicidal? I ask. How do I ask somebody about how they're doing? I start with something. You look tired. You didn't sleep well last night. What's going on? You know, once you start that conversation, what people don't feel like they're tied into it, and what am I supposed to do with it? Most of the time, I was taught this a long time ago by someone who was a great marriage therapist. Your secret to your marriage success is ask your wife if she needs something. A lot of times she'll say no, but guess what? You just got brownie points because you asked. And that goes a long way for you because you may not have to do anything. You may have to be that listening ear.
Who
and
are
I've
you
benefited
married to?
of that plenty of times. Especially when it comes to the kitchen. My wife's a great cook, so it's not that I'm a bad cook, but when it comes to those things, I ask. And when you do that, that goes a long way because then if they are needing resources, we talked about seasoned individuals. You guys have plugs to reach out to folks, and that keeps them in a healthy place. And that's the really big thing is, we talk about big picture connections, but it's also local connections, especially post-pandemic when we're trying to figure out what this new sense of normal is.
Yeah, meaningful connections that build healthy relationships is what we're really talking about. The Army families are amazing people. I want you to just, for a moment, just be grateful for what you have. All the difficulties, all the things that you're asked to do, but if you can have gratitude out in front and just, we are so much better. Looking at my wife, we are so much better because of you. It's just that simple. And the things that we've shared together, the journey that we've walked together, the hardships that we face together, they strengthen us. And this is and they pay us for this, right? I'm seriously, I think about it every day that this calling that we've been given the privilege to do to serve this great nation and Army's people and their families, you're just amazing to me. You inspire me more than you know with the things that you do each and every day. But I want to leave you with this thought. As you experience difficulty, you're growing. Okay, I'm going to say it again. Be thankful for the difficulty because you're what? You're growing. Okay? But everybody reaches a point in the growth and in the struggle where you need somebody else. Everybody needs somebody sometime. Are you old enough to know that song?
I was just waiting for the karaoke to start.
There you go.
So I just have to get the qualifiers out there. Right? So we reach a point, and whether that's behavioral health, the chaplain, some other care provider, a family member, a friend, nobody should be alone. We were not made to be alone. None of us are hardwired that way. And when we isolate and when we're alone, we have to look for lonely people. We have to find them, and we have to care for them. That's not a program. That's what we should do, investing in people, connecting them in spirit, and cultivating community. So thank you for the privilege that you've afforded me to be your chief of chaplains in this season.
Such wise words from my seasoned friend here. I just love that. I could just say amen and we could go home. I think the key to combating that loneliness is to remember we're not alone. Don't try to go it alone. Again, that American spirit of independence sometimes is our Achilles heel. Get to that point that you need help and ask for help, and then over time maybe learn to ask for help one step before that breaking point. But as we remember, we're not alone. We are part of family is the word that comes to my mind. This Army family that is worldwide, young and old, all kinds of generations and skin colors and backgrounds. We're not alone. And so if we feel lonely, it's probably because we haven't found or accessed the resources available. So let's be there for each other. Let's combat that loneliness by just remembering we're not alone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I've really enjoyed the talk today. And I want to bring Holly back up here to close us out. Thank you.
Wow. How blessed are we to have access to all these programs and resources, and even those that we didn't have time to cover today. But I do want to share something with you, if you don't mind. I want to share what I saw in front of my eyes today, the magic of making those connections and building relationships. As we were preparing for this forum, we all connected virtually first, which Mrs. Halverson mentioned, any connection is better than no connection. You've heard that throughout the theme today. So we connected virtually. It wasn't until this morning that many of us met each other in person. We came from all different locations and we didn't know each other, but we met this morning. And then you also heard on stage here that relationship and connection grow through collaboration and discussion, because one of the example, Casa Taylor, you said to Ms. Rogers, hey, we'll talk about that and connect later, right? The power of growing relationships. It grew so much. I saw the magic, right? Before we came up on stage, they were actually talking about Dr. Lewis leading them in a karaoke song, and I won't tell you what that song was that they selected. So thank you, Dr. Lewis, and thank you to each and every one of you for your insight, your expertise, and your personal stories and sharing with us. So please help me give Dr. Lewis and the panelists a round of applause. And thank you, Mrs. Halverson, for being the introduction to our theme and setting the theme. We appreciate you, and thank you for being our senior fellow. Thank you again to Leidos, the team Leidos, for making this forum possible today. So we hope that you found the forum beneficial and valuable to each and every one of you. I'd like to leave you with a thought. How will you go forth after today's forum and build and enhance your connections and relationship? But better yet, how will you pass that on and connect with someone else and teach them to pass it on? So as you heard today, there are a lot of programs and services available. And thank you, Dr. Lewis. Yes, we have the exhibit hall downstairs, but did you know that many of the panelists up here have a booth down there, right? So please go down and check it out. And right next to it is the AMC kiosk about the Digital Garrison app. As you heard yesterday, what a better way to stay connected. So go down there and visit that. And we will continue to keep you connected through our podcast, co-hosted with Mrs. McConville and Mrs. Grinston, bringing you the relevant resources to our families and to our communities today. Also, one other plug, AUSA has our 120 chapters, all volunteer run. Stay connected or connect for the first time with them. It's free, doesn't cost you anything. We would love to have you as the AUSA family. So one gentle reminder, it's that time. We will have our QR codes in the back of the room and we'll put them up on the screen. Get those phones out, tap into the QR code, give us your feedback. We want to hear from you and set us forward for the future themes for our family forums online. You can tap in on our QR codes online. So this concludes our second family forum. We are looking forward to seeing everyone here at 1500 with the town hall with our Army senior leaders. So enjoy the rest of your day and we'll see you shortly.
Oh.
Fabulous, fabulous, fabulous.